To understand the fear, you first have to understand the silence. Imagine a world without light, a world where the sun has never touched the ground. You are 400 feet beneath the surface of the freezing North Atlantic. The pressure against the steel hull surrounding you is immense, enough to crush a human body into a chaotic organic paste in a fraction of a second. Down here, there are no satellite feeds, no frantic calls to Washington or Moscow, no eyes, only ears. In this abyss, survival is a mathematical equation. It is a game of blind man's bluff played with nuclear shotguns. One wrong move, one dropped wrench, one sudden cavitation of a propeller, and you don't just lose the game, you trigger the end of the world. This is the story of the most dangerous game of tag ever played. A story of a 1,000-mile hunt through the most hostile environment on Earth, where a crew of American sailors shadowed a monster capable of erasing 200 cities in the blink of an eye. If you are fascinated by the hidden battles of the Cold War, by the men who held the line in the darkness while the rest of us slept, you need to hear this. To truly grasp the stakes of this mission, we have to rewind the clock. The date is November 3rd, 1983. If you look at the history books, 1983 was the year the Cold War almost went hot. It was the year of paranoia. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at a breaking point not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just 2 months prior, in September, a Soviet interceptor had blasted Korean Airlines Flight 007 out of the sky, killing 269 civilians, including a sitting U.S. congressman. The rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin was apocalyptic. Yuri Andropov, the ailing Soviet leader, was convinced, genuinely convinced, that the Americans were preparing for a decapitation first strike. The KGB had activated Operation Ryan, a desperate intelligence sweep to look for signs of imminent nuclear war. NATO was preparing for Able Archer 83, a command post exercise so realistic that Moscow believed it was the actual cover for an invasion. The world was holding its breath. And nowhere was that tension more palpable, more suffocating than in the Norwegian Sea, 400 miles northwest of Tromsø. Hovering in the cold dark was the USS Parche. She was a Sturgeon-class attack submarine. At 292 feet long, she was a predator, but an aging one. She wasn't the newest boat in the fleet, nor the fastest, but in the silent war, speed is secondary to stealth, and the Parche was a ghost. Inside the red-lit control room, the air smelled of recycled oxygen, ozone, and stale coffee. Commander James Whitfield stood at the center of the con. 23 years of service, a man who knew the ocean better than his own backyard. He had commanded Parche for 14 months, drilling his crew until they operated with a hive mind efficiency. They had been sitting in their designated patrol sector for 72 hours, waiting, drifting, listening. The Sturgeon-class boats were hunter-killers. Their job wasn't to launch missiles at cities, their job was to find the submarines that did. And on this morning, at 03:47 hours, they found the ultimate prize. Sonar Technician First Class Michael Garrison was hunched over his console, headphones pressing against his ears, eyes scanning the waterfall display of green, cascading lines. Then he saw it, a jagged line cutting through the static. Con, sonar, new contact. Bearing 285, range approximately 42 nautical miles. Classification, Sierra class? No. Wait. Garrison refined the frequency. He listened to the rhythm of the screws. This wasn't just any submarine. This was a low-frequency rumble that shook the water column. It was the acoustic fingerprint of a nightmare. It was a Typhoon. To call the Soviet Typhoon-class a submarine is an understatement. It was a floating fortress. Designated the Akula class by the Soviets, but known to NATO as the Typhoon, it represented the absolute zenith of Soviet naval power and NATO's deepest fear. Picture 2 full-sized submarine hulls wrapped inside a third, massive steel outer shell. At 574 feet long and displacing a staggering 48,000 tons when submerged, the Typhoon was the largest submarine ever constructed in human history. You could fit the USS Parche inside of it and still have room for a basketball court. But it wasn't the size that terrified the West. It was the payload. Inside that Leviathan were 20 RSM-52 ballistic missiles. NATO codename, Sturgeon. Each missile stood as tall as a building. Each one carried 10 independently targetable nuclear warheads. Do the math. One Typhoon, 200 warheads. A single vessel possessed the destructive capacity to incinerate every major city on the east coast of the United States, and the Soviet Union had 6 of them. Their strategy was simple. Build a boat so big, so tough, and so well protected that it could hide under the thick ice of the Arctic, immune to NATO airstrikes, waiting for the order to end the world. But this one, K-211, wasn't hiding under the ice. She was moving. Commander Whitfield looked at the sonar solution. The intelligence value of what was happening on his screen was incalculable. NATO knew the Typhoons existed. They had satellite photos of them sitting at the docks in the Kola Peninsula. But they didn't know how they fought. They didn't know their patrol patterns. They didn't know their blind spots. Whitfield realized this was the moment every attack skipper spent a lifetime training for. He wasn't just going to track a blip on a screen. He was going to trail a ballistic missile submarine through an extended patrol. He was going to crawl inside the enemy's shadow and live there. But there was a problem. The Typhoon was massive, yes, but physics was on her side. The USS Parche was dwarfed by her quarry. If the Typhoon was a sledgehammer, the Parche was a scalpel. Whitfield had advantages that wouldn't show up on a spec sheet. He had the BQQ-5 sonar suite, the most sophisticated underwater ear in existence. While the Soviets built for size and depth, the Americans built for silence and processing power. The Parche could hear a shrimp snap its claws from miles away. More importantly, Whitfield had his crew. American submariners drilled the trail and shadow operation until it was muscle memory. They knew the Soviet doctrine better than some Soviet conscripts did. They knew that trailing a boomer, a ballistic missile sub, was like stalking a tiger in tall grass. Get too close? You risk detection. If K-211 hears you, they might assume you are positioning for a kill shot. In the hair-trigger atmosphere of 1983, that could lead to a torpedo in the water before you could say sorry. Fall too far back? The ocean swallows the sound. You lose contact, and a nuclear-armed city killer vanishes into the dark. The balance required constant calculation, split-second geometry, and nerves of absolute steel. Whitfield made his call. "All stop," he ordered. The command was spoken at a normal volume, but it carried the weight of a gavel strike. The Parche's single screw ceased turning. The boat drifted, carried only by the momentum and the current of the Norwegian Sea. She hung in the black water, silent, listening. This is the most vulnerable phase of the hunt, the initial detection. You have to figure out exactly where the target is, how fast they are going, and how deep they are, without letting them know you are even in the same ocean. Sonar Tech Garrison worked his console like a concert pianist. Target bearing steady at 285, range decreasing slowly, speed estimate, 8 knots, depth assessment, 400 to 500 feet. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, leaned over the plotting table. He ran the geometry. Based on acoustic propagation, the way sound waves bend and warp through different temperatures of water, he found the solution. If K-211 kept going straight, Parche could slot in 2,000 yards astern. We'll be in the baffles. The baffles. The blind spot. Directly behind a submarine, the noise of its own propeller churns up the water, creating a cone of deafness where its own sonar cannot hear. If Parche could get inside that cone, she would be invisible. But getting there meant moving, and moving meant noise. Whitfield looked at his crew. The men in the fire control party, the helmsman, the plainsman, They were young men, mostly in their 20s, responsible for a machine of war in a time of peace that felt like war. "All ahead 1/3, Whitfield said. "Make your depth 600 feet. Come left to course 270. And then, the order that changes the entire psychology of the boat. Rig for ultra-quiet. Rig for ultra-quiet is not just a switch you flip. It is a total transformation of life aboard the ship. It means the non-essential pumps are bypassed. It means the ventilation is turned down to a whisper. In the galley, the cooks stop chopping vegetables. No pots banging, no loud voices. If you drop a wrench in the engine room, that sound travels through the hull and into the water like a gunshot. Men moved in socks. Conversations ceased, replaced by hand signals and whispered technical data. Sleep, watch, eat, silence. For the next few weeks, the 107 men aboard the Parche would exist as ghosts. As Parche began her slow creep toward the intercept point, the sonar team began to dissect the Typhoon. Despite the billions of rubles the Soviet Union poured into the Navy, they had a fatal flaw. They were loud. The Typhoon's twin nuclear reactors required massive cooling pumps. Her propellers were enormous. Every rotation carved a hole in the water, generating cavitation, bubbles that collapse with a distinct noise. Parche crept forward. 3 hours and 47 minutes of agonizingly slow maneuvering, speed fluctuating between 3 and 9 knots. By 0734 hours, the geometry locked in. Parche slid into position, exactly 2,300 yards behind the K-211. Depth, 650 feet. Course, 265 degrees. They were locked on. The leash was attached. The hunt had begun. But ahead of them lay the gap, the treacherous stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. And beyond that, the open Atlantic, where the weather was turning and the Soviets would begin their deadly dance to shake any pursuers. Whitfield settled into his chair. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee. The easy part was over. Now they had to stay attached to an erratic, lethal giant for 1,000 miles, without blinking. The movies make submarine warfare look like a sudden, violent spasm of action. Torpedoes in the water, alarms blaring, captains shouting orders. But the reality of what the USS Parche was doing? It was 1,000 miles of excruciating patience. It was a knife fight in a phone booth where neither fighter is allowed to move faster than a crawl. By November 4th, the crew had settled into a rhythm that defied the natural order of life. The sun didn't rise or set. Time was measured in 6-hour watch rotations. 6 hours on the scope. 6 hours trying to sleep in a rack that smelled of diesel and 106 other men. Maintaining a trail position sounds simple. Stay behind the other guy. But in the North Atlantic, nothing is simple. The ocean is not a swimming pool. It is a chaotic system of currents, salinity gradients, and thermal layers. Sound waves bend. They bounce off the surface and the bottom. Sometimes a submarine 5 miles away sounds like it's next to you. Sometimes a submarine 1,000 yards away disappears completely into a shadow zone created by cold water. The plotting team on the Parche wasn't just tracking a target, they were doing trigonometry in 4 dimensions, constantly adjusting depth and speed to keep that acoustic lifeline connected to the K-211. And the Soviets? They weren't stupid. They knew the Americans were out there. They knew that trailing was the NATO game. So they had a move to counter it. November 4th, 1420 hours. Commander Whitfield was on the con when the tone of the hunt changed instantly. "Con, sonar, target is shifting aspect, blade count dropping, he's slowing down." On the display, the lines representing the K-211 went erratic. The massive Soviet boat didn't just slow down. Without warning, she threw her rudder hard over. She turned 90 degrees to starboard, cutting her speed to 4 knots. This is the maneuver every American submariner dreads, the Crazy Ivan, or, in technical terms, clearing the baffles. The Soviet captain turns his boat perpendicular to his previous course. By doing this, he moves his own propeller noise out of the way. His sonar arrays, which were previously deaf to anything behind him, now sweep the ocean directly where a trailer would be hiding. It's like walking down a dark alley and suddenly spinning around with a flashlight to see if someone is following you. If Parche kept moving forward, she would cruise right into the K-211's sonar path. If she turned too hard, her own propeller would cavitate, creating a noise spike that would scream, "I am here," to the enemy. Whitfield had anticipated this. He knew the Soviet doctrine, clearing turns every 8 to 12 hours. "All stop," Whitfield said, his voice level. "Make your depth 800 feet. Come right to course 355. This was the counter-move. Parche didn't just stop. She dropped. She flooded her ballast tanks and sank like a stone, diving deeper into the cold, dense water where sound travels differently. Simultaneously, she turned away from the K-211's new path. They were deliberately letting the target get further away to keep from being seen. For 45 minutes, the two submarines drifted in the dark. The K-211, now steady on her new course, listening. The Parche, hovering in the deep, silent. The psychological pressure in that control room was corrosive. Everyone knew the rules of engagement. In international waters, the lines were blurry. If the Soviet captain detected them, he was authorized to defend his ship. He might just ping them, hit them with active sonar. It sounds like a hammer striking the hull, a loud, ringing insult that says, "I see you." Or he might turn to attack. Then K-211 accelerated. She turned back to her original heading. The crazy Ivan was over. The Soviet captain was satisfied he was alone. He was wrong. As the Typhoon picked up speed, Parche rose from the depths, increased her turns, and slipped right back into the blind spot, 2,300 yards astern. The tick had reattached itself to the dog. But the hardest part of the journey was just appearing on the charts. They were approaching the GIUK gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. The choke point. This is the gateway between the Soviet Arctic and the Atlantic Ocean. It was the most heavily surveilled stretch of water on Earth. The threat wasn't just below them, it was above. Soviet naval aviation knew their boomers were transiting. They sent the Bears, Tu-142 maritime patrol aircraft, to sanitize the route. These massive 4-engine turboprops would fly low over the waves, dropping sonobuoys, listening devices that float on the surface and dangle microphones deep into the water. Sonar Tech Garrison heard it first. A splash, then another. "Con, sonar, transients in the water, sonobuoys active." Now Whitfield was playing 3D chess. He had to stay close enough to the K-211 to mask his sound in her wake, but not so close that he hit her. And he had to do it while dodging a net of microphones dropping from the sky. If a sonobuoy landed right on top of them, it was game over. At one point, a Bear F thundered directly overhead. The crew of the Parche could almost feel the vibration of its engines through the hull. They froze. If the aircraft got a hit, it could drop a homing torpedo within seconds. But the ocean is big, and the Parche was quiet. The aircraft circled for 3 hours, frustrated, before turning back to base. By November 6th, they'd cleared the gap. They were in the North Atlantic proper. The water was deeper, the currents stronger. And then, the behavior of the prey changed. K-211 slowed to 6 knots. She began weaving, changing course frequently. She wasn't transiting anymore. She was arriving. She was entering her patrol box. Soviet strategy relied on these boxes, areas of the ocean roughly 800 miles east of Newfoundland. Here, the submarine would loiter, moving just enough to stay afloat, waiting for the order to launch nuclear missiles at New York, Washington, and Boston. Whitfield stared at the chart. This was the moment of decision. Trailing a sub in transit is hard. Trailing a sub in a patrol box is nearly impossible. In the box, the target moves at a crawl, 3 or 4 knots. At that speed, they are almost silent. They deploy towed sonar arrays, long cables trailing miles behind them that eliminate the blind spot. To follow K-211 into the box was to walk voluntarily into a trap. The risk of detection would skyrocket. But Whitfield's orders from Sublant were clear. The intelligence value of watching a typhoon on patrol, seeing exactly how they prepared for Armageddon, was worth the risk. Whitfield looked at his XO, Lieutenant Commander Hayes. "We're staying with him," he said. They were about to enter the most dangerous phase of the operation. The transit was over. The duel was about to begin. The patrol box sounds like a fixed location, a square on a map, but in reality, it is a fluid, three-dimensional kill box. On November 7th at 06:20 hours, K211 arrived at her station, and immediately, the game changed. She deployed her tail. A towed sonar array is a thick cable, miles long, studded with hydrophones, unspooled from the back of the submarine. It allows the boat to listen to the ocean behind it, effectively erasing the blind spot. The baffles were gone. If Parche stayed directly behind K211 now, she would be swimming right into a net of sensors. Commander Whitfield had to improvise. He ordered the helm to offset the ship. Parche slid out of the wake and positioned herself off to the side, riding the flank of the Soviet giant. The margin for error, which was already thin, vanished. They were now operating in the open, inches away from detection. For the next 4 days, the two submarines engaged in a slow-motion duel. K211's pattern was methodical. She would cruise for 6 hours, then stop her propeller entirely. She would drift, turning into a silent, listening hole in the ocean. Every time K211 cut her engines, Parche had to freeze. Rig for ultra-quiet became the permanent state of existence. When the Soviet sub drifted, Parche drifted. Both crews, separated by a mile of dark water, holding their breath, waiting for the other to make a mistake. These standoffs lasted 45 minutes. 45 minutes where a dropped spoon in the galley or a loud cough in the torpedo room could travel through the water and trigger World War III. But the risk was yielding gold. Parche's sonar teams were recording everything. They captured the acoustic signature of K211's pumps at various depths. They recorded the sounds of her maintenance crews hammering on equipment. They were building a fingerprint of the enemy so precise that in a future war, NATO forces could identify this specific submarine by the sound of its toilet flushing. But luck is a finite resource, and on November 11th, the account ran dry. 14:30 hours. The K211 did something the manual said she wasn't supposed to do. She didn't drift. She didn't do a standard clearing turn. Instead, without warning, the massive Typhoon threw her rudder hard over and reversed course. A complete 180-degree turn. She was coming back down her own track, head-on. "Con, sonar, target is coming around, bearing changing rapid. He's heading 180 relative." Commander Whitfield looked at the plot. His blood must have turned to ice. The geometry was a nightmare. If he turned Parche away to run, he would expose the full broadside of his submarine to the K211's sonar, making him look like a barn door on a radar screen. If he stayed the course, he would collide with the Typhoon, or pass so close that the collision alarm would do the Soviets' job for them. If he tried to dive, the rush of water into the ballast tanks could create a sound transient, a noise spike. He had 3 seconds to decide the fate of his crew. "All stop," Whitfield said. "Make your depth 1,200 feet. Maintain absolute silence." It was a gamble, a terrifying one. Parche vented her buoyancy and began to fall. She wasn't driving down, she was falling, slipping into the abyss to get under the oncoming truck. The depth gauge spun. 800 feet, 900 feet, 1,000 feet. The hull groaned as the pressure mounted, squeezing the steel ribs of the ship. Above them, the K211 was thundering closer. 1,800 yards, that was the separation. In ocean terms, they were in the same room. For 12 minutes, the Parche hung suspended in the black water at 1,200 feet. The crew froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They looked up at the ceiling of the pressure hull, imagining the 48,000-ton monster passing overhead. They were well within the detection range of the Typhoon's sonar. If the Soviet operator was alert, if he looked down at the right second, he would see them. He would see a distinct, metallic anomaly lurking in the deep. And if he saw them, the torpedo tubes on the Typhoon were already loaded. The sound of the Soviet screws washed over them, a mechanical heartbeat that filled the Parche. It was the sound of a predator stepping over its prey. And then, it began to fade. The K-211 kept going. She settled back onto her patrol course. Her sonar operators had missed the American Ghost sitting in their basement. Whitfield let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a lifetime. "Return to trail depth," he whispered. "Resume station." Parche slowly pumped water out, rising back up to the hunting grounds. She slid back into position, 3,000 yards astern this time, giving the monster a little more room to breathe. They had survived the close call, but they weren't done. For 2 more days, they tracked the K-211. They cataloged 47 distinct mechanical signatures. They photographed her hull. They stripped her of her secrets. By November 14th, the mission was accomplished. The tapes were full. The crew was exhausted. And a coded message came through on the VLF radio from Sublant. "Job well done. Come home." At 04:45 hours, Parche peeled away. She turned for Scotland, slipping into the darkness, leaving the K-211 to continue her patrol alone. The Soviet captain never knew he had been shadowed for over 1,000 miles. He never knew that his vessel's secrets were now sitting in a magnetic tape reel on an American mess deck. 4 days later, the Parche surfaced in Holy Loch, Scotland. The hatch popped open, and for the first time in weeks, the crew smelled fresh air. They were greeted not by a parade, but by intelligence officers from the NSA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The spooks took the tapes, shook a few hands, and disappeared. There were no headlines, no breaking news. The crew of the Parche got hot showers, a few beers, and a pat on the back in a classified ceremony. Commander Whitfield received a medal that couldn't be listed on his public record. The crew went back to work. Because in the silent service, success isn't fame. Success is survival. When the USS Parche pulled into Holy Loch, Scotland on November 18, 1983, she didn't look like a hero. She looked like a tired, salt-streaked machine of war. Waiting on the tender were the men in suits. Analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence, the NSA, and acoustical experts from the Naval Underwater Systems Center. They descended on the submarine like vultures, stripping the magnetic tapes from the recorders before the engines had even cooled. Why? Because what Whitfield and his crew had brought back was worth more than its weight in gold. In the days that followed, that data was rushed to the Pentagon. It was briefed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. The recordings of K-211 weren't just noise. They were the key to the castle. The acoustic signature of that Typhoon was digitized and uploaded into the sound libraries of every NATO submarine and maritime patrol aircraft. From that day forward, if a Soviet Typhoon turned a screw in the Atlantic, NATO would know exactly who it was, where it was, and how fast it was going. The tactical patterns, the way K-211 cleared her baffles, the way she deployed her towed array, were dissected by strategists. They developed new counter-tactics, specific maneuvers that American attack subs could use to kill a Typhoon before it could launch its missiles. This single patrol shifted the balance of power in the Atlantic. It proved that despite the Soviet Union's terrifying technological achievements, they had lost the most important race of all, the race for silence. The Typhoon-class was a marvel of engineering, a double-hulled, titanium-tough 48,000-ton beast designed to survive the apocalypse. But it was a dinosaur. The Soviets had bet on size and survivability. They built submarines that could take a hit and keep fighting. But the Americans? They bet on never getting hit in the first place. The Parche and the Sturgeon-class boats were ghosts. Through better propulsion, better mounting systems that isolated vibration, and hull coatings that absorbed sonar, the U.S. Navy had achieved acoustic superiority. It was an asymmetry that defined the end of the Cold War. The Soviets had the brawn. We had the ears. But the real story of the Parche isn't about hydrophones or hull plating. It's about the 107 men who lived inside that steel tube. We often talk about the Cold War in terms of presidents and premiers, Reagan and Gorbachev. But the war was fought by 20-year-old kids from Ohio and Nebraska, sitting in the dark, staring at a green screen for 6 hours at a time, terrified that a blink could mean the end of the world. The crew of the Parche endured 2 weeks of ultra-quiet. They whispered. They walked in socks. They didn't shower. They lived with the constant gnawing knowledge that a torpedo could be in the water before they even heard the hatch open. Submariners suffered higher rates of stress-related illness than almost any other service branch. They came home to wives and children they couldn't talk to. "How was work, honey?" was a question they couldn't answer. Commander James Whitfield eventually retired as a captain. Sonar tech Michael Garrison, the man who first heard the K-211, made chief. They received medals and closed rooms, with no cameras and no applause. And that is how they wanted it. The Cold War is over now. The Soviet Union is gone. The Typhoon-class submarines are rusting in scrapyards or serving as floating museums. But the legacy of that patrol remains. Operations like the Parche Trail proved that free societies, when disciplined and determined, could outthink and outmaneuver totalitarian giants. They proved that deterrence works, not just because we have missiles, but because we have men willing to go into the dark and watch the enemy, unblinkingly, for 1,000 miles. They didn't seek glory. They sought to do their job, to hold the line, to make sure that the silence of the deep remained silent. And in that, they succeeded completely. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the Cold War, you're in the right place. There are thousands of stories like the Parche buried in declassified files waiting to be told. Stories of espionage, close calls, and the technology that kept us from the brink. Hit that subscribe button on Cold War Stories, turn on notifications, and join us next time as we descend back into the depths, to the front lines of the war that was never fought, but always present. This is your narrator, signing off.